as I mentioned it. As I mentioned in one of my emails, this year, the slogan for World Migratory Bird Day is protect insects, protect birds. And so part of the whole thing of biodiversity is encouraging the health of insects, which obviously help birds, but they also help a whole lot of other things like our food. So anyway, I'll let you do the talking now, Jill. Thank you very much for being with us.
Right, thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to start sharing my screen if that's all right.
Just to have a sec, Jill, I have to make you a host.
Okay.
Go and make host. So you should be able to share your screen now.
Perfect. All right. I'm just going to start screen sharing now. Yes. All right. Does that show up all right for everybody?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So the topic today is gardening for biodiversity. And thank you so much for the introduction for the nursery. And I'm going to dive into it a little bit more. So Satinflower Nurseries is located on the traditional territories of the Saanich people. There's 4 village sites on the peninsula, which is Sartlip, Sayo, Cowcachin, and Sycam. We also just opened a second location out in Metchosin, which is on the traditional territory of the Chianu Nation. And it is also shared with the Sauk Nation, Songhees, and other Lekwungen-speaking peoples. And we're extremely grateful to the traditional stewards of this land, and we strive to follow in their leadership of land stewardship. So our nursery has 3 primary focuses, and this is education, potted plants, and seed production. So education is something that we really strive for. The nursery is owned by 2 biologists and was started with the inspiration of providing more plants for local restoration groups, as well as educating the public on how we can restore biodiversity at home. So some of the programs we have are our Meadow Makers program, which is teaching and educating members of the public how to convert lawns into meadows, as was mentioned in the bio. Specifically in this region on the island, we primarily had Garry oak ecosystems and Garry oak meadows. These habitats are incredibly at risk, so creating these islands of biodiversity in urban areas is extremely important. We also offer workshops. Just last week we had Habitat Acquisition Trust, which is a large environmental nonprofit group here, coming into the nursery and learning more about the native plants. We really value these relationships we have with other groups and other organizations, and really enjoy sharing the knowledge that we have, and also bringing together different members of the community with different backgrounds to all come together and share with the intention of preserving the local ecology. So we also grow potted plants for wholesale and retail. Like I mentioned before, the nursery began with the intention of providing plants for restoration projects. Essentially, all our plants are from collected locally, so everything is local provenance. Nothing is harvested from the wild, and we really discourage people from going out and taking plants from ecosystems. So by growing them in the nursery and everything, all the seeds collected, we have government approval to collect from areas and work with other nurseries that grow endangered species with local governments, so that we can ensure that these species continue and are able to be planted for restoration projects and also aren't being taken from critical habitats. Growing seeds is also a really critical part of this. So not only do we grow everything or as much as we can from seed, we sell the seed, and we also use the seed to sow. for our own plants at the nursery. And I'm going to talk about a bit later about the importance of growing from seed for biodiversity and the ways we can start our own native plant seed banks at home. So I know that this group is very passionate about ecology, so this is probably an obvious question. And because this is over Zoom, I know we can't yell this out, but just thinking about it in whatever space you're in right now, what is a native plant? And I mention this because with the rise in popularity of native plants in home gardening, the lines kind of the lines kind of get blurred a little bit with native plant cultivars that are different colors and all these different things that these plants are being grown for. And so what really defines a native plant? And so there's a lot of different ways to determine if a species is native or not. These include historical data, genetics, paleoecological data, habitat, cultural relationships, as well as relationships with other native organisms. And that's what we're really going to focus on today. So in these photos, we have some really, some of my favorite native plants. That's what I selected them for. Goldenrod is absolutely beloved by pollinators, red columbine as well. And the broad-leaved shooting star, Primula hendersonii, I selected it for this photo, for this slide, because it's a really amazing example of the relationships that pollinators and plants have with each other. So Primula hendersonii is pollinated through buzz pollination. So only bumblebees are able to pollinate them. No other bee is able to access the pollen because the plants actually hold on to it until it vibrates at a certain frequency that only the bumblebees can vibrate in, and then it releases the pollen. And this is because bumblebees are the most effective pollinators, so they don't want to release their pollen for any other species that might not ensure their reproductive success. So this is an example of that coevolution between native plants and pollinators that is this really beautiful relationship over generations and generations of generations, just evolving together to support each other. So who are the pollinators that we're talking about? So a pollinator, as many of you may know, is anything that helps carry pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. And over 85% of flowering plants require pollinators to reproduce. And the other percentage of plants that don't require pollinators to reproduce are the wind-pollinated plants. And interactions between plants and pollinators has influenced their evolutionary traits to support these mutually beneficial relationships where they support each other. So this can be found at the Pollinator Partnership website, and this was edited slightly just to make it a little bit smaller, but I thought this is a really amazing example of some of these relationships and what the different plants and insects have evolved to signal to each other. So when bees are out looking on a landscape, when they're waking up for the season and they're seeing these white or yellow or blue flowers, they know that those plants are grown and are an indicator to them that they have the adequate floral resources for them. They'll have enough pollen for them. They'll have the correct landing pads for them, so they're not having to work really hard to get into that flower and wasting a whole bunch of energy trying to access only to find that it doesn't have the adequate floral resources for them. Same with butterflies, birds. They all have all of these different specifications that are signaling to the pollinators who do the best job at pollinating them to come here, come to me, and then they'll have the best, reproductive success. Also, chocolate lily is a really amazing Garry Oak ecosystem plant that can be found on the island, and it has a really mottled brown look to it. It's like leans over, and then if you smell it, it has a really strong putrid odor, and this is because flies pollinate it. So the flowers and the pollinators are speaking to each other, really. And a lot of times when we think of pollinators, we think of the bees, but butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, birds, bats, they all play, less so bats in this region, but in other regions, they all play a really fundamental role in transferring pollen between plants. Additionally, we have to think about these pollinators and all their different life cycles. So when we go in the garden, we see something's eating our plants that might be seen as a pest, but caterpillars, cutworms, and other larvae are often regarded as bad in a garden, but they're actually just a life cycle in the lives of some of our key pollinators in this region. So kind of reframing the way we think about these different insects we find in the garden through all their life cycles and how they're all important. Additionally, with this in mind, when we're thinking about how far each species has to fly to find different floral resources, especially in areas that are more urban or in farm fields that may not have a whole lot of space for flowers to be growing, planting larger patches of these plant species really allows for a better foraging efficiency for the species that are looking for them. As well as ensuring there's flowers blooming throughout the season, there's lots of native plants that bloom really early in the year and really late in the year, but that will just ensure there's a large diversity of pollinators, because a lot of these pollinators, right when they're coming out of dormancy, is when certain flowers like spring ephemerals are coming up. And so they've co-evolved to kind of align their schedules. And an example of this is with the rufous hummingbird. They migrate from the south, and their migration in return coincides exactly with when Ribes sanguineum is blooming, as well as salmonberry. These are some of the really early blooming flowers. And in the previous slide, it mentioned how scarlet, orange, and red flowers are really attractive to birds. And so having these early bloomers is just signifying to these migrating hummingbirds that their food is here, they can come to these flowers, and they will get adequate floral resources from them. Sorry about that, my screen froze for a second there. And so some of the other relationships that I find really, really amazing are host plants. So there's lots of plants that have relationships with pollinators that's not just about the flowers, it's also about laying their eggs on them. And so these are all butterfly plant relationships and native plants in this region. So California brome is a host plant for the woodland skipper butterfly. This means that this butterfly is looking for this plant at the time to lay its eggs, and it's really, really picky. They can be quite picky about where they choose to lay their eggs. And so a lot of these plants are the host plants that they're going to be looking for at that time. So you can expect to see, if you're planting these plants, more of these species that depend on them. I visited a whole bunch of properties recently, doing site visits for different meadows, and all the properties that had ocean spray all had this ring azure butterfly. And the ocean spray is a host plant for this butterfly. So bringing these species into these spaces is also bringing back the pollinators that depend on them and provides a ton of habitat. Stinging nettle is also a really, really good example of an important host plant. There's many other species that depend on these plants, but I just chose a few for this slide. And stinging nettle, the three that I mentioned, I put those three on there because they will only lay their eggs on the stinging nettle. So those three species of butterfly will not lay their eggs anywhere else. And if there isn't stinging nettle that they can find, they just won't lay their eggs. And stinging nettle is an interesting one because people are quite hesitant to plant it in their garden often because of the stinging properties of it. However, it's also a plant that is really heavily foraged. So a lot of it is taken out of the ecosystem frequently by often well-intentioned people who are only taking 10%, 20%. But if everybody goes out and takes 20% of that patch, it's just taking more and more away. And if people aren't returning to that site every year and don't see what the health looks like if there's a decline in health of that plant, these patches can disappear. And especially in more urban areas where there's a lot of pressure from not only urban development and expansion, but also foraging and other factors, having these plants in our home gardens can ensure that these species that depend on them have a place to reproduce. And then when we see those caterpillars on them and that some of the branches are getting eaten, knowing that that means that the plant is doing what it's meant to do and it's providing forage for these species. So now that we've talked about some of the native plants, what are some of the non-native plants that we might find in our gardens? So non-native plants are not, we all depend on a lot of non-native plants. I have non-native plants in my garden, most people do. All of our food and veggies come from native plants. And there's a lot of different reasons why we might have plants in our garden, whether it's for food, for visual enjoyment. But as long as we know that these plants aren't necessarily providing adequate pollen or meeting the needs of pollinators in this region. And this is because most have been adapted for either the pollinators of the region that they come from, or they've been changed through horticulture practices to be visually pleasing. An example of this is this sunflower in the photo. I think it's called a woolly, I can't remember what the cultivar is called. It's not a woolly sunflower, which is a native one, but I think it's called the teddy bear sunflower. And you can see all of these petals are really, really dense. And it's that bright yellow color. So when pollinators see it, they might think that, oh, it's bright yellow. That means this flower is signaling to me to come to it because it has the adequate resources for me. So then the bees might come and work really, really hard to try to access the pollen in that flower. And once they access it, there might not be enough there because this flower hasn't been cultivated for the pollen. It's been selectively reproduced in greenhouses for the floral, the visual appeal of the flower. And that's the same with a lot of different cultivars, as well as native cultivars, some native plants that are grown in different colors or have double flowers. So they're selected for their visual appearance and not necessarily for their qualities to support local pollinators or the ecosystem. And some of the plants that provide floral resources, like we see lavender, we might see lots of bees on something like lavender or different plants. There's bees all over them. And often when we look closely, we'll see that it's the generalists, which means that these are the pollinators that can receive pollen from a lot of different flowers. And for the bees, those are bumblebees. Bumblebees are generalists, so they can receive pollen and nectar resources from a variety of flowers. Most specialist bees cannot. They're looking for those native plants in the landscape. And another bee that you might see on a lot of these flowers is honeybees. And so a lot of times when we think of save the bees, people immediately think of honeybees. I've had people tell me that they have beehives with the intention of saving the bees, but having a honeybee hive to save the bees is kind of like having chickens to save the birds. They're not very effective at pollinating different plants. This is because they have really tidy pollen sacs. Trees are not very messy, which is great for them because they can bring lots and lots of pollen back to their hive and create lots of honey. But for the flowers, that means that the pollen isn't necessarily moving from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, so there's less chance of reproductive success. In addition to that, honeybees can really be a vector for a lot of different diseases to native bees, like the varroa mite is something that really negatively impacts native bees and is a disease that affects honeybees quite frequently. And also the high density colonies can lead to exploitive competition, and they can really monopolize floral resources. So in areas where there's not a ton of flowers and food for the native bees, then when they're having to compete with the honeybees, it can be quite disruptive to them and put quite a strain on their foraging. I also wanted to point out this study that was done in the Canary Islands, where they found a decline in structure and function of pollination networks in natural ecosystems within 24 hours of installing a honeybee hive. And over the course of a 3-year study, they also noticed not only a reduction in the diversity of wild pollinators, but also a reduction in reproductive success of those plants that were most highly visited by them. So there's over 450 native species of bee in BC, 70% of them are solitary and ground nesting, so they need access to bare soil. And 30% of the native bees are cavity nesting, such as leafcutter and mason bees. And we're going to talk more about kind of providing that habitat for them in our own gardens in a little bit. But yeah, I just wanted to really highlight that native bees come in a variety of shapes and sizes. The length of their tongue is widely varied. And all of these traits are the result of thousands of years of evolution that has allowed them to specifically adapt to the plants and flowers that they have these relationships with. So what are some threats to biodiversity? Some threats that are impacting not only the pollinator-plant relationships, but other parts of the ecosystem. So these are some of the main ones that I want to touch on today, and the first one being changes in historic disturbance regimes. So as many of us know, Indigenous peoples have stewarded these local since time immemorial. And research has shown that Indigenous management practices and Indigenous managed or protected lands harbor the greatest amount of biodiversity. So these land practices show us that human presence on the landscape itself is not harmful, and the biodiversity crisis is not rooted in human nature. Oh, I think we have some background noise. There we go. And so the next one I want to touch on is invasive species. So what makes a plant invasive? And I know we said for everyone to kind of think of this at home, but also if anyone does want to kind of shout it out, if you have the volume option, feel free. So these are some of the main invasive species that I encounter, but there's many. So as I'm sure you all know, an invasive species is not only not native to the ecosystem, but it also causes environmental and economic harm or harm to human health. So they can of native plants and animals, diversity and habitats. Prior to working at the nursery, I worked for an environmental nonprofit and did habitat restoration primarily in riparian areas up island, and I saw habitats completely infiltrated, just like a monocrop of invasive species in riparian areas, specifically with knotweed, which is really hard to treat in riparian areas so close to the water. English ivy is another example of one that lots of people still plant in their garden. And it's a bigger conversation in horticulture about how to manage these invasive plants being sold in garden centers. Many garden centers still sell English ivy, as well as yellow flag iris and other really harmful invasive species, as there's just not the regulations that there should be to prohibit this, unfortunately. Another one I wanted to highlight is blackberry, Himalayan blackberry, trailing berry, which is a really incredible species for many.
Jillian, if I could just interrupt for a second.
Kind of outcompete ivy in a restored area. Oh,
Jillian,
pardon me, sorry?
Just to interrupt for a second, could everybody please mute themselves and turn off your video? We're getting some interference here.
All right, is everyone able to hear? Okay. Yeah, so Himalayan blackberry is one that a lot of people have a relationship with. I mean, I grew up in this area and I have memories of harvesting blackberries with my family, collecting buckets of it. And a lot of people would say that it provides resources for the birds. Lots of birds eat the blackberries. But something I have found interesting that I learned recently after visiting one of the bird banding stations on the island is that they were noticing that during the times of year when the blackberries are out, a lot of the birds were altering their dietary habits to eat a whole bunch of blackberries. And it's kind of like fast food for these birds. So it's really high in sugars, but it doesn't necessarily have the vitamins and minerals and nutrients and proteins that they need when they would be eating insects or other seeds. And so they were actually noticing some species of birds had more brittle bones and were actually breaking their bones in the nets that they were catching them for bird banding, which I thought was really interesting and unfortunate. But yeah, so even though it is providing food for some species, it's not necessarily what has been in the landscape and what is needed for those species and what is going to support their health in the best way. So the last thread I want to touch on today for biodiversity is urbanization and fragmentation and habitat loss. So habitat fragmentation can be really critical for a lot of species when these islands are created and there isn't the connectivity between them. And species aren't able to travel from one habitat to another between these communities. This results in migration being reduced and genetic diversity being limited from one area to another, not only for insects and birds sometimes, but also plants too, where the genetic diversity of pollination isn't able to happen as much as these species aren't traveling in between these areas. And when we go to, or not honeybees, sorry, native bees, they are only able to travel certain distances from their nest. So large bees like bumblebees, they can forage up to 1.5 kilometers from their nest. Medium-sized bees, like mining bees or leafcutter bees, they can fly about 450 meters from their nest. And small bees, like sweat bees and small carpenter bees, they can only fly about 100 to 200 meters from their nest. So when we're thinking islands of a garden, are all their needs being met in those areas, and the ways we can create these paths of connectivity through other landscapes, whether we're creating habitat in our gardens that's going to connect to other habitat nearby, it can have a huge impact. When remaining habitats aren't necessarily large enough to support all the species and all of their needs, creating these networks can really help connect them. So this leads us to the topic for this talk, which is gardening to restore biodiversity and some of the things that we can do in our own homes to support the ecosystem. And sometimes we don't all have a huge garden or a huge backyard that we're able to grow plants in, and that's okay. Balcony gardens and patio gardens can also create a lot of habitat when we're thinking about these floral resources and the species that depend on them, as well as the ability to lay eggs and nest. Even these small areas can create these connectivity networks in urban areas. So some of the things we can do at home, removing invasive species. If we have invasive species on our property, these can spread to other areas. Even if we're keeping or we think we're keeping it contained, some bits of the plant taken by birds or taken through other ways, the berries or the seeds can be spread to other areas and they can have really negative impacts on natural areas. And also leaving bare soil, which seems counterintuitive when we're thinking about having a messy garden and not tidying. We often think of mulching. But since 70% of the bees in this region are ground nesting, they actually really depend on this bare ground so that they can nest into. And when we're covering up the soil really deep and having this thick layer of mulch, which we can do in some areas of the garden, and as we should to build up the nutrients in the soil, also leaving other areas, bare patches for these. I work at Seed Field Hill. I'm one of the managers for a seed field, and we try to grow one species per row, which isn't what you typically do in a garden where you have many different species growing. But for this reason, certain rows like our camas row, it's quite bare for most of the year. And there are so many ground nesting bees there, and they just buzz like crazy. I was just there last week weeding it, and they're flying all around us, and they have so many holes in the ground, and they just absolutely love it because it's surrounded by farm fields there. So they don't have a ton of bare soil that isn't being frequently worked. And also on that note, not over tidying, and this means leaving a lot of those stems that might not be very visually pleasing in the perspective of traditional gardening styles. When I went to horticulture school, we're taught to cut everything back in the fall, take it away. But leaving some of those stems upright, and the hollow stems can be a place where a lot of bees, when you think of those mason bee hives, they really like those circular little stems in the bee houses. But in a lot of habitats, that would just be in the stems of plants. And you'll have a lot of insects overwintering, as well as the seed heads of these plants offer really critical forage for birds. Other things we can do at home, lawn to meadow conversions if we have that space, green roofs, stormwater wetlands. Something we're doing at the nursery at our new location is all of the roofs of the buildings on site. There's a house and a workshop on site, and all of the water from those is going to a pond that is, we're going to line half of it. It's not lined right now, but the amount of birds that use that space is absolutely incredible. We have killdeer nesting on the property, and the parents go to that space every day and have baths and drink the water. And on the note of killdeer and birds, I'm sure that lots of people in this group already know this, but if we have pets, dogs should stay on leash, especially this time of year when ground nesting birds are out in the environment. And also cats should be indoors. There's a lot of ground nesting birds, and even having those collars with the rainbows on the birds can see isn't going to help the nests if they find a nest of some of these young birds. So this time of year, especially when it's nesting season, is a really critical time to be aware of pets and be aware of their interactions with the ecosystem. And then the last thing on the list is planting native plants. So planting native plants is really the backbone to ecological restoration. Not only does it respect, conserve, and restore biological diversity, like I was mentioning, it really increases connectivity and the size of habitats. It supports the wildlife that has co-evolved with it, and it can be a really incredible educational opportunity for us and for youth and for everybody to connect with these natural spaces. Growing native plants is an opportunity to learn about these species. A lot more schools are growing native plants for youth education, and it can create a sense of relationship with these species in our area, and also a sense of responsibility that benefits and respects future generations. As well, it also reduces water usage. When we're planting plants that want to be in these habitats, they're not going to take as much resources in terms of water. If we're planting dry, drought-loving plants that enjoy drainage and full sun in habitats that are dry and have a lot of sun, they're not going to require as much intervention because they're meant to be there. A lot of plants in classic horticulture require a lot of intervention and care because they don't necessarily come from this region, and they aren't necessarily happy here. And the ones that are too happy here sometimes become invasive species. So planting the plants that want to be here and that the ecosystem depends on is a really incredible way to encourage biodiversity in our home spaces. And on the note of education, something that I do, I'm really trying to learn the native grasses right now, which is very difficult. There's a lot of different ones. I've got some of them down, but I'm planting them at home and I'm growing them from seed and getting to know how they look through all the different seasons, all the different life stages, and trying to learn more about them. As well, accessibility can be a barrier sometimes to enjoying these natural spaces and connecting with these plants, but bringing these plants into spaces in home gardens increases the ability for people of all mobility levels to enjoy them and connect with them. So the dusky winged butterfly is an example of a red-listed species that thrives in Garry Oak ecosystems, primarily on the island. There are some Garry Oak ecosystems on the mainland, but not as many as here. And they're a species that has a relationship with the host plant, which is the Garry Oaks. They will only lay their larvae in leaf litter, or they only lay their larvae in the leaves of the tree, which then when the leaves fall as leaf litter on the ground, they overwinter on the leaves and then hatch in the springtime when the sun heats up the leaves and warms it up, and then it kind of indicates to them that it's time to wake up and emerge. Unfortunately, with the trend of having really tidy gardens, people are inclined to remove all the leaf litter, and whether it's being mowed or removed altogether, this is just taking away all of the eggs and the larvae of this species, and it's becoming an incredibly at-risk species. Whereas if you go to a Garry Oak meadow, you're quite likely to see them because their habitat is just being taken away through the removal of these leaves, and it's quite easy to bring them back by keeping the leaves there. So there's these little things we can do that have a huge impact and can really help support these species. And having a messier garden, leaving the leaves, leaving spaces, and not cutting these plants back is creating a lot of habitat that we might not even realize. And so another example of plants that leaving the inflorescences over winter, even if they're not necessarily what some horticulturalists would consider visually appealing, I find them incredibly beautiful. I absolutely love in this photo the ocean spray. The inflorescences, they look like little stars over the winter when the seeds are gone. They're really small and really beautiful. And they have, when they're in bloom, they have these bright white flowers that look like ocean spray, essentially, which is where they get their name. And they're incredibly critical, not only as a host plant to several different butterfly species, but their seed pods provide food for birds over the winter. So through every season, they have so much function and habitat, and they're just alive with life. And so viewing beauty in a different way and viewing how impactful these species are, not just for human perception, but also as a part of a healthy ecosystem. And some of the other species that often are cut back as perennials, like goldenrod, mugwort, California aster, these species grow from the ground up every season. And they leave these flower stalks, but when you leave the flower stalks, it provides a lot of habitat in terms of seeds as well as overwintering. Snowberry is also another really awesome one. It has these white berries that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and the birds kind of eat them over the winter. And they just stay on the plant, they dry up a little bit, but instead of having bird food or bird feeders over the winter, having these plants is a natural way to provide forage for them, for the seeds, and also for the insects that inhabit them. It's part of a healthy ecosystem to have plants that will harbor more insects and more food for these birds. So these plant and bird, insect, all these relationships, host plants, is something that is still really, we're still learning about. We don't know everything. There's so much that's still being researched. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with iNaturalist, but I have to mention it because it is such an important tool for citizen science. And it also was really helpful for identification for myself and for others. It's a way to, if for anyone who isn't familiar with it, it's a site that you can upload photos and the locations you find them. And it provides a tool for scientists and others to see the distribution of these species and where they are. And sometimes people find really rare species that we didn't even know there. I've uploaded photos that I'm not familiar with and discovered that it was something more rare than I was expecting. And it's a really nice way to track all these species. I also use them for when recommending plants, seeing if plants naturally occur in these areas. With the rain shadow here, our climate and our habitat is a little bit different than outside of the rain shadow, which receives a lot more rain. So checking whether these species occur in these different areas when selecting plants for the region. Like I mentioned before with native plants, kind of some places blur the lines on what is a native plant, and plants that are native to Ontario or the eastern side of the country will be advertised as a native plant to this region when there actually aren't any that occur here, and there aren't any pollinators or species that have the relationship with this plant. So the efficiency of it for supporting the ecosystem, it's not really as impactful as a species that actually naturally occurs here. And so if you're ever confused about that, there's a lot of different online resources, but I use iNaturalist quite frequently. And so when we're preparing these spaces at home, site prep is really, really critical to ensure that we have success. And there's a lot of different methods. This is a screenshot of a PDF from our website that talks about some of the different ways you can prepare the area for restoration. And this applies to home gardens as well as larger restoration sites in natural areas. The method really depends on the site, and this resource can be quite helpful for determining what is most appropriate for the area. And species selection is also something really critical to consider when we're thinking about how we're actually going to install this restoration project. So like I mentioned before, being less dependent on external forces like water, or also, external interventions, I suppose, which are going to put more of a strain on the environment. Planting species that will be happy in that space is the best way that we can support these habitats, rather than imposing our perspective of what we think this area should look like. Kind of taking a look around and seeing what's already naturally occurring there. Or I really enjoy going for hikes and observing what's in natural areas and thinking about what these landscapes look like. And then when I do a site visit and I see a landscape and I'm picturing what this landscape, what the baseline kind of is for these areas and what we can plant it to be, thinking about plants that would be happy in that area. So for a sunny, dry meadow, some of the species here are field chickweed, which is a low-growing, semi-evergreen perennial, nodding onion, which is a really late-blooming one. Sorry, those ones are on. Chickweed's on the bottom left. Nodding onion is one over to the right from the chickweed. Grindelia, or gumweed, is that yellow flower. And we call it the bee hotel because it blooms from June all the way till November. And that's not even an exaggeration. It actually blooms that long. It has so many different flowers, and you can observe so many different bee species on it. And they kind of like nap on the flower too. So it's really good for taking images. And they thrive in really poor soil that doesn't have a lot of moisture and not a lot of nutrients. You'll often see it growing on the beach, or I've seen it growing like on the side of construction sites where you wouldn't expect a plant to be growing. So it's a really nice one for observing pollinators and supporting those species. Harvest Brodea is the one on the right, often found on beaches, really lovely purple flower. And then if we have more of a shade area, these are some plants for more of a moist shade habitat, whether you have a north-facing space or you're planting in a forest. All these plants have different functions, different relationships, different bloom times. The two on the left are more spring ephemerals, trilliums. The strawberries are more of an evergreen feature. I've even seen them be used as a ground cover in some areas, bracken fern. And all these plants are ones that you might not typically think to include in your home garden, but they're an incredible addition and provide so many benefits, not only for the people who enjoy these spaces, but also for all the creatures that inhabit them. So our website is a helpful resource, I find, for choosing plants, and it has this drop-down menu where you can consider the features, bloom time, habitat, soil. But whether you're using the website or not, these are some of the features that I like to consider when I'm thinking about how a plant is going to fit into a habitat, how it's going to fit in with the other plants, making sure there's an array of plants that have that evergreen structure, as well as some ephemerals that are going to support those pollinators that are emerging certain times of the year and looking for them, overwintering, larger areas that have more trees or a shrub layer, and having a mix of them and enough forage for these species that depend on them is quite critical. Hedgerows are something that is also really important and being used more in farm fields, actually, because it can host so many pollinators and birds that eat more like farm pests, which are just, yeah, insects that exist in these habitats, and creating these systems that kind of, yeah, sustain themselves. So these are some resources on our website as well for if you're trying to think about what plants to put in some more challenging sites. And also sometimes it can be really hard to find plants for something like rocky outcrops where a lot of plants might struggle. If we think about the habitats we exist in, they all have plants that do well in them. So every space does have plants. And rather than, like I mentioned before, imposing what we think those spaces should look like, looking and getting inspiration from natural areas to see what's already naturally occurring there. What are the species that thrive in those habitats? So sunny slopes is something that can be really challenging in terms of water uses in a lot of gardens. However, all of these plant species absolutely thrive. I have a rocky outcrop at home that I do not water, and I don't want to water it in front of my house. And yeah, I have the nodding onion, yarrow, sea thrift, mugwort, field chickweed, woolly sunflower, all these species I've planted, and they're so lush and beautiful. It looks like I water it all the time, but they're actually just really happy in that space, and it's meeting their needs. So I'm not having to change the space for the needs of the plant. I'm choosing the plant based on the conditions of the site. And so sometimes finding like inspiration can be helpful. So some of these resources on our website, or you can find online for all native species, can be really helpful when choosing plants. So once you get your garden established, something really cool that you'll find is you have a native seed bank of native species. So native seed production for ecological restoration. The genetic variation creates resilience in outplanting and allows a single species to be more tolerant across a range of environmental variation. So when we're thinking about plants and collecting seeds from many different plants, we're not just collecting plants from a species that has certain flowers or the most bright colors. We're collecting them from all plants. So this ensures genetic biodiversity and is also really helpful for supporting the continuation of this species. So they're more adaptable and have a lot of different adaptive traits. So native seed crops have a broad genetic base, are adaptable and non-uniform. So we're not selecting based on certain traits. We're trying to keep it quite even across all species that are being collected from. And native seed collection is quite critical as there's many species, like I mentioned before with native cultivars, certain species like columbine, Aquilegia formosa is the native red columbine, but there's lots of different species of purple columbine, white, and all kinds of variations, and they actually cross-pollinate. So having those species in your garden that are the variants can impact the native versions of them. And so if you're near a natural area and you have those garden cultivars of the native species, they can actually change the genetics of the species in surrounding areas, which can have really harmful impacts because the species that are grown for their color don't necessarily have the same floral resources and can change the color of the plants in natural spaces, which is going to give off different signals to the pollinators and might not necessarily be as attractive to them if the red columbine is all of a sudden purple or white. And it just can negatively impact the species. So considering when we have plants in our garden that can cross-pollinate, lupin is another example of it. There's lots of different lupin species, but large leaf lupin, there's a non-native version of it that is planted all along highways, and it can cross-pollinate really easily. It's also grown in a lot of gardens with the native version of it, and then it has different traits that will change the traits of the ones that are naturally occurring or the native ones. So collecting seed from the seed bank that we have at home can be a really incredible way to preserve these species. And it can be a really lovely way to share with others and grow more plants, and kind of keep an eye on exactly where these seeds are coming from. Sometimes buying seed packets that are pollinator mixes from different nurseries that aren't being as considerate of where these seeds are coming from and how they're being grown can actually introduce some non-native cultivars and change the native species. But anyways, I'm getting too much into that point. So for seeding at home, whether you choose to plant from pots or plant from seeds, seeds are adapted to germinate for the ideal conditions of those plants. A lot of annuals will germinate right away and don't require cold stratification, whereas other plants do require cold stratification, meaning they need that cold and wet period over winter in order to indicate to the plant that, okay, the winter is over, it's getting warmer, it's time to grow. So we typically recommend sowing in the fall because this is the best time. It's more in line with the natural systems that are occurring, and it's going to give the plants that aren't that don't require cold stratification just a little bit more time to grow over the winter. So species like sea blush, which is a really beautiful pink annual that you probably see out blooming right now, they have all winter to grow and get strong, so then they can bloom right away. On our website also, though, there's no way to cover all of these things in one talk. So if it's helpful and you feel inspired to grow more plants from seed or plant from pots, we also have some resources on our website with a bit more specific planting instructions and tips that we find helpful and that we use at the nursery when we're propagating our plants. And these are just some examples of some incredible meadow conversions that we've been a part of, and the before and afters, and how much work and thought and consideration goes into creating these spaces. And they're not maintenance free. They do require weeding. There are invasive species, but they can be a home for so many incredible native species and just create such an impact on local ecology. This is a septic field meadow conversion. And the before and after is really striking. It just kind of looks like it has always looked like that. But it was a very intentional design. So I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end in case there are any questions, but happy growing and planting. And I hope this might inspire you to include some more native plants in your own home spaces.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was really very, very interesting. A lot more to it than I actually thought. And I'm sure people have questions. I see Audrey's got her hand up there already.
Good. Jillian, this has been wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to checking out your website. It just seems to have so much information that I need to have a look at. I've got a few questions. The charts that you had up initially that had to do with plants and colors and hummingbirds, are they also on your site?
So that one isn't from our website, but actually I pulled it from pollinator-partnership.ca. They have the same chart, but I kind of condensed it a little bit with some of the facts that I thought were more related to this talk. But that entire chart is on pollinator-partnership.ca.
Partnership, okay. I'm trying to get this written down. And do you must have something on site preparation on your website too.
Yes, there's some PDFs on site preparation and kind of choosing the correct site prep for your space that you have, as it can kind of depend on the different species that are there, as well as different grass species, what's already there. If it's a septic field, it might just be bare soil, but if it's a garden that has, or a lawn that has grass, you might be able to just smother it. Some properties will use like just cardboard and then soil right on top of it, and that's effective. Other people use controlled burns. If there's really aggressive invasive grasses, it can be helpful. So there's a range of considerations, and it kind of depends on the space that you have and what's already existing there.
Okay, the use of cardboard and then putting soil on top, how long does that have to sit for? I would think the cardboard has to disintegrate. So is it a year? 2 years? What are we looking at? I don't have lots of years left.
With the cardboard, I mean, some people will do a round of smothering with like a sheet of plastic to kind of kill what's already there. Like black plastic can be solarization. Some people will just dig up, if it's really aggressive grasses, you can just dig it up and replace the soil and put down some cardboard to stop any remaining rhizomes from coming back. Yeah, and for the cardboard, so I actually just put cardboard down in my backyard, and I had I'm not sure what kind of grass it was, some lawn mix of grass that the previous owners had put down. And I just put cardboard down in the fall and put soil over it, over part of it. I didn't actually have enough soil to cover all of it over winter. And it's completely killed the grass underneath, because the cardboard that didn't have soil on top of it has broken down in between September when I put it down and now. So there's no cardboard left, but there's also no grass growing there. So it kind of depends on what kind of species you have in that space and how they'll respond to it. Some grasses have really aggressive roots and they will come back, but yeah, trying to ID them when they're in bloom can be a helpful way to do it, or just digging it out and getting rid of it can be a more immediate way to do it.
Okay, and my last question is, I happen to spy the note that you said that you do on-site consultations.
Mm-hmm.
How far afield do you go to do that? Do you come over to the Vancouver area?
Yeah, so we do, transportation is included in the fee for site visits, but we do virtual consultations. So that might be something that would be more helpful. And in that way you can kind of show videos and also share photos. And yeah, the owner of the nursery, they're both biologists. They're really incredible grass experts. So they are able to answer a lot of questions in that regard, even if it's online. So
Thank you again. I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, I'm so happy.
Okay, do other people have questions? Are there questions from the church?
You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Any questions in the room here? I can repeat them. Yes, Bruce. Okay, so there's a question about pollen mites and mason bees. Wondering if your website has any information on that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure if our website, oh, sorry about that. There's some background voice here. I'm not sure if our website has any information about mason bees. But Pollinator Partnership website would. We work sometimes with them for different courses, and they would definitely have, I know that they have that information on their website, and if we have it on ours, it would likely be a PDF from Pollinator Partnership, because they specialize in pollinators and bees, and that would be the place to look for how to have a healthy mason beehive and the cleaning methods for them. It is something that we do at our other location at the nursery, but I'm not sure, because we're more especially in plants. We do have some PDFs on butterflies and more plant insect relationships, but for specifically cleaning mason beehives, I'm not sure that that's one that we'd have.
Okay. And Bowdy, did you have a question? Yep. So yeah, she can't hear you, Bowdy. Like I just have to repeat it in through here. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a question around scarifying a lawn in preparation for wildflower meadow. And to what extent you have to light or very aggressive, do you know?
So I would say it depends on the species, and for scarifying, is that like flame weeding?
Sorry, what?
Is it by scarifying, do you mean like flame weeding? space.
Flame weeding? What do you mean by scarifying?
Basically removing the grass.
Rem- Remove, but like how much of the grass and grass roots do you have to remove?
Okay. Yeah, so it would depend on the grass species, and you can kind of see based on the roots of the grass how deep they go. There's a meadow that I help with the volunteers with sometimes, and they have colonial bent grass, which is a really aggressive grass that's grown as a cover crop in farm fields. And when you dig it up, you can see the roots go like quite deep. They can go almost like a foot deep into the ground. Whereas other annual species of grass, or like orchard grass, for example, is one that you can really kind of get the individual root out. Orchard grass might not be the best example because you do have to get the entire root out, but you can kind of follow the roots and try to remove all of them. And I would say, because it really depends on the grasses that are there, some of them respond well if you just pull them before they drop seed. They will essentially not come back, and it will only take a year or so to remove the seed bank. Other ones can, depending on what species it is, they can regenerate from the rhizomes. And orchard grass is an example of that, whereas something like sweet vernal grass, if you pull it out, it has more of a seed bank that builds up in the soil, but if you pull it out before it drops its seed, that one's not coming back. So I would say it's kind of site specific, but I would just try to remove as much of the roots as possible. And sometimes if you are weeding out the grasses, then solarizing with a clear sheet of plastic in the summer, then the heat can kill a lot of the seeds and kill a lot of the remaining roots. Pulling it off, you can also use black plastic, which will smother it in other ways too. It will have more heat trapped on it and can make it warmer. There's a few different methods. And then pulling it off, I'd leave it on for a few months, pull it off, see what comes up, put it on again for another few months, and then take it off. And then, yeah, that is something that I do find quite effective, depending how aggressive the grasses are. So it's kind of hard to say without knowing what species are there. And part of it is really just getting to know the site and seeing how it responds to it, because there's such a variety of invasive species or grass species that can be occupying it that will respond in different ways to different forms of intervention. I'm not sure if that really answered the question. But yeah, I think trying to remove as much of the roots as possible is always the best method, while yeah, trying to save the soil that's already there. But if there's a large seed bank of invasive species, then those can sometimes regenerate. But yeah, there's different methods to eliminate the seeds through solarization, flame weeding, and different techniques.
Yep.
I have kind of a general question, Jill.
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Bowdy just had a follow-up. Just 1 second.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You okay? Okay, he's okay.
It's okay, okay. I couldn't hear him, so I didn't realize that. No, you work with the restoration of Garry oak ecosystems. Do you feel optimistic about how that's working? I know that the Garry oak ecosystems are in deep trouble. Do you think that the work that you're able to do is going to be enough?
I hope so. Yeah,
Probably not a fair question.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely yeah, mixed feelings of I feel a lot of joy in the community of people I meet that are very passionate about restoration and dedicate so much time and energy towards restoration. And I definitely think I'm noticing an increase of more and more people who are kind of waking up to the importance of this work and the importance of the ecosystems and these yeah, I hope that this it happens in time, I guess. I notice in a lot of parks and natural areas getting loved to death in a way, and not necessarily always enough funding for invasive species removal. So I do think that a lot of people care, and a lot of people want to be stewards of the land and create positive change. And it's just kind of finding that bridge and meeting those gaps to actually make it happen. And I do feel hopeful, and I try to do what I can to leave the space or leave the world a better place than I found it. And I feel that lots of people feel the same. So I just hope that the work continues in a good way.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad that people are really seem to be interested in making this happen, and different groups, and as long as there's funding made available as needed, which I'm sure is a problem, but
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think sometimes, oh, sorry, someone else have a question?
No, I was just following up on the Garry Oak. So I think if I understand it right, the Garry Oak ecosystem is contained to Vancouver Island. Is that right? I'm not sure that we have any space on the mainland that's native Garry Oak habitat.
none.
So I guess my question is, like, if I wanted to grow a Garry Oak, is there any benefit to that since I'm not on the island?
Yeah, there are some small patches of Garry Oak habitat on the mainland. I looked it up before this talk just because I wanted to be certain of where those patches were. And they're quite small. So if you did want to grow it, I don't think it would be negative. It would provide habitat, and it is quite close to maybe looking on a map where some of those other habitats are naturally occurring. But what I tend to do when I'm looking at a space to restore is thinking about what the baseline is in a way, what other natural areas are occurring around there that you could create connectivity with, what other habitats and species are already naturally occurring that might benefit from certain species, and what those plants are essentially. So if there's other Garry Oak meadows in the area, or it's an area that used to be primarily Garry Oak meadow, then definitely. But if it's like a woodland, and which I'm sure it isn't, but if you're having to remove other species and kind of change the landscape to impose something that maybe doesn't fit for that space, it might not be the best choice. So kind of just taking those considerations in mind when thinking about what that space needs and what would be most beneficial.
Right.
Thank you. So anyone have more questions?
Any more questions in the room? Joni? No? No,
I'm
we're
not-
good here, Elizabeth. That was great, Jillian.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions that come up later, you're always welcome to send me an email too. Yeah, and I'm always happy to answer anything.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jillian.
You're welcome. Thank you for
The honorarium by e-transfer.
Thank you.
Okay,
I really
thanks again.
appreciate it. It was lovely talking with you all.
Thank you.
Do you have a number for the people in the room? Somebody there?
I'll get it to you later, Elizabeth.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just yeah.